Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming to the Data Colada seminar series. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Geoff Goodwin, and we're joined by a series of panelists: Paul Bloom, Anna Gantman, Chelsea Hellion, David Pizarro, and Gracie Renecke. As well, Joe Simmons and Yuri Simonson will be here with us. For all of you out there, you'll see at the bottom of your screen there's a Q&A function where you can submit comments or questions that will all get to Geoff eventually. He'll be busy probably, but the rest of us can read them, and when possible, we will interrupt him and voice those questions or comments to give him a chance to respond. But that's all the basics. Otherwise, the floor is all yours, Geoff.
Great, thanks a lot, Leif. And thanks very much to you and Joe and Yuri for putting on this series throughout the pandemic. It's been fantastic, and I'm pleased to be part of it. So let me just share my slides here. And I'll play those. That all good? Okay, so yeah, this is a project on euthanasia and specifically how people make judgments about euthanizing humans and animals. And my collaborator is Henry Hung, who's a very talented philosophy undergrad here at Penn. So to start with, I'd ask you to consider this question of whether humans are above animals in their sort of overall moral standing or status. From a traditional deontological point of view, I think the answer here is a pretty clear yes. Immanuel Kant famously talked about this issue, and the general perspective coming out of deontology is animals lack rational capacities. That's the basis for moral standing, and so they therefore have lower moral standing than humans. So in Kant's words, he expresses this as non-rational beings have only a relative value as means, and they're therefore called things, whereas humans are an end in themselves. The modern day deontologist Peter Carruthers puts this point even more starkly. He thinks that animals lack moral standing entirely, and they therefore don't have rights. I don't think you have to go that far to be consistent with deontology, but I think the answer from this philosophical perspective is pretty clear yes, humans are above animals. The picture, I think, is a bit more complex from a consequentialist or utilitarian perspective, but it is still mostly yes. So for a utilitarian, I think the predominant feature that grounds moral standing would be an entity's capacity for suffering. But even consequentialists like Peter Singer, who is notably famous for his work on animal liberation, still thinks that humans are above animals precisely because they have this greater capacity to suffer. So unlike an animal, a human can represent the distant future and the past, and that gives them access to all kinds of negative emotions that animals don't experience, like guilt and dread and shame. And they also have plans which might go knowingly unfulfilled. So it's a bit more complex, but I think utilitarians would say, yeah, humans are generally speaking are above animals in their moral standing. And okay, so that's from a normative point of view. There's also, I think, a fair bit of evidence that's emerged from moral psychology in recent years, which I don't think is terribly controversial. It also shows that ordinary people reliably make this kind of judgment as well. So I'll just go through a little bit of that. So there's some work on this notion of a moral circle of concern. And in that work, Crimston and colleagues have shown various interesting things, but among the basic points is if we look at this pictograph of the circle of concern, central points represent greater concern and therefore greater moral standing. You can see that a variety of human groups, including outgroups and including stigmatized groups, are afforded greater moral standing than animal species, including both high and low sentience animals like a chicken on the low sentience side and a chimp on the high sentience side. There's a related stream of recent research by Lucius Caviola and colleagues, and they've been investigating this concept of speciesism, which is sort of an analog of racism, but just with respect to species. And they've got this scale, which includes items like the following. So morally, animals always count for less than humans. Humans have the right to use animals however they want to. There is variance in people's endorsement of those items, but I think in general, there's widespread endorsement of those sorts of ideas as well. And from that same set of investigations, there's some interesting work on donation amounts. This was actually quite an interesting task. So subjects were given 100 donation points that they could allocate between two different charities, and they were told truthfully that the experimenters would donate $100 to these charities in proportion to the average judgments made in the sample, which is kind of a creative method, I think. And the comparison on the left here is just kind of generically a charity that would help animals versus one that would help humans. There's not a totally uniform preference, but there's a general preference for charities that help humans. And then on the right-hand side, we've got a more specific comparison, which is between chimpanzees and a charity that would help mentally severely disabled humans. And again, there's a pretty clear preference for humans, notwithstanding the fact that on average in this study, the subjects judged the chimpanzees to have greater intellectual functioning than the severely disabled humans. So I think there's sort of plenty of evidence that points in this direction of, you know, people think that humans have higher status. And I think that's a fairly uncontroversial starting point. Related to this, and I think stemming from this, is that we have these deontological ethical rules that prohibit the active killing of humans. So it's thought to be an especially bad thing to kill humans. Bernard Goethe is a noted moral philosopher, and he's got these books where he tries to outline 10 moral rules which he thinks account for all the kinds of actions that are prohibited or required. So it's a very ambitious attempt. But number one in his system here is the rule don't kill. And I don't think he says explicitly humans, but it's pretty clear that that's what he has in mind. I'm no great biblical scholar, but you can turn to the Bible as well for moral guidance. And obviously within the 10 commandments, there is the commandment, thou shalt not kill. I didn't know before this study that this is actually not the top commandment. It's only number 5, with all 4 of the top 4 commandments all having to do with expressing loyalty and fealty to God. And only then do you get to thou shalt not kill. Not that it's necessarily a rank order system, but still that's kind of interesting. Okay, so we've got these ethical systems that prohibit actively killing humans. And relatedly, we have this very well-known distinction between killing and allowing. And so this is being talked about a lot in moral philosophy. It's been studied in moral psychology. It's often thought to be worse to actively kill a person than simply to allow that person to die. And this is, I think, a very interesting idea. And I'm particularly interested in it in this talk in the context of biomedical ethics, and the fact that what this typically means is that active euthanasia of humans is typically prohibited, whereas passive euthanasia is not. And there are obviously restrictions around passive euthanasia, but it's less prohibited. There's variance within the United States. So there are some states, I believe, in the United States that allow physician-assisted suicide, but that's not the same thing as active euthanasia, which is, you know, actively killing the person. And so just to kind of express this a bit more formally, the American Medical Association has some interesting remarks on this idea. So in 1975, they opined as follows: the intentional termination of one human being by another, mercy killing, is contrary to that which the medical profession stands and is contrary to the policy of the AMA. And at the same time, they expressly allowed that under certain conditions, passive allowing, it's probably passive allowing rather than passive killing, that's permissible. So the cessation of employment of extraordinary means to prolong the life of the body when there is evidence that biological death is imminent is the decision of the patient and the immediate family. Okay, so that's an interesting state of affairs, because there are certain cases where it seems that active euthanasia seems like a more humane option. So you can think about this in cases where somebody's in intractable pain, there's no hope of the pain being alleviated, and death is certain to result. That's just one possible case. This is a little thought experiment by the moral philosopher Rochelle, who asks us to consider of a patient who's dying of incurable cancer and is in terrible pain that can't be alleviated. Patient's certain to die within a few days, even if the present treatment is continued, but doesn't want to go on living for those days because the pain is unbearable. So asks the doctor for an end to it, and the family's all on board with the request, but the prohibition against active killing does not permit this. So even though killing the patient would cause less pain, seems like a more humane option, it's prohibited, and all that is allowed morally and legally is passively allowing death in this case. That seems like an interesting and maybe slightly perverse state of affairs. And before I sort of get to the hypotheses that we were looking at here, I want to just give one other real world example, which I think is an especially poignant example of this. It's a case of a guy called Tony Dickinson, who at age 51. He was a British man. He was paralyzed from the neck down by a catastrophic stroke. And he suffered from this condition, which is called Lockedin Syndrome, which basically involves, total paralysis. In his own words, he describes it as follows. So most of my body is paralyzed. My mind is as it was before the stroke. All I can move is my head, and the stroke took away my power of speech. Now I talk to people with a Perspex spelling board or a computer operated by my eye blinks. In that same essay, which you can read online, he describes his condition as a living nightmare. And there's a picture of Tony Dickinson after his stroke. And this was a very interesting case, which was widely publicized. So just sort of some key facts here is that after having lived with this condition for several years, he wanted to die. His wife, family, and friends all supported this decision. But the Lockedin syndrome is such that it prevents him from taking his own life. So he's just physically unable to commit suicide. So this is an especially telling case for active euthanasia. And he sought a court order to allow a doctor to assist him to commit suicide without fear of prosecution. And before seeking that court order, he wrote as follows: "It can't be acceptable in 21st century Britain that I'm denied the right to take my own life just because I'm physically handicapped. Suicide is not illegal, yet apart from all of the misery he endures in this condition, there's also this lack of agency in being unable to commit suicide." And he also wrote that it's astonishing that we can put a man on the moon, yet still cannot devise adequate rules for government-assisted dying. So that was the sort of background, and the High Court of England and Wales refused his request. This is what he had to say shortly thereafter, again in his own words. So we lost. He was crestfallen, totally devastated, and very frightened for the future and the misery it's bound to bring. And I think there he's explicitly referring to the fear of what his death would be like. And he goes on to say, this is sort of interesting. I suppose it was wrong of me to invest so much hope and expectation into the judgment, because I really believed in the veracity of the arguments, quite simply could not understand how anyone could disagree with the logic, but I guess I forgot the emotional component. Okay, so 2012, when he was 58, he'd lived with the condition for 7 years. Dickinson began refusing food. He contracted pneumonia and declined rapidly shortly thereafter. And fortunately, from what I can tell, his death was not as miserable or painful as it might have been. But still, I think you can look at this and say his death was clearly not what it could have been. And so that's sort of, I think, an interesting and poignant case to kind of, make a philosophical argument for the permissibility of active euthanasia in certain cases. I would just say as well, some more background on this, Lockedin syndrome is clearly not a common condition. It affects about 1% of people who suffer from strokes, but on aggregate, that's still a large number of people. Not every single one of those people want to die. Some do, though. And of course, there are other cases, including cases that involve intractable pain, where there may be other reasons why a patient might wish a doctor to take or at least assist in taking their lives. But I think Lockedin syndrome is a really important test case because of the fact that the patient is physically unable to commit suicide. And so the only option is something like active euthanasia. Okay, so I think this is an interesting and sort of perverse situation where you can argue that it's precisely because we value the lives of humans so highly and have these attendant moral rules about prohibiting active killing that we are actually in a situation where we're prohibited from doing something that would actually further their best interests. And the contrast case for this talk is the case of animals. And for animals, this idea of mercy killing seems much more widely accepted. So people will, not directly themselves, but they'll ask a vet to put down their pets all the time because of painful conditions in order to spare them the misery. And the interesting thing about this is the reason that that seems morally acceptable is precisely because we think it's in the animal's best interest. This would be best for the animal, and that's why we think this is an allowable thing to do. And so I think it's fairly obvious that this is much more accepted. You can even find on the web various manualized approaches for handling this. So to just give you a kind of parochial example, this is a document that I found from the Western Australian Departments of Parks and Wildlife, which outlines standard operating procedures for the humane killing of animals. And this is the table of contents, just the first part of it you can see that we get into deciding when this is necessary, how we should go about doing this, and then various kinds of killing methods and their pros and cons for killing animals. Okay, so
Geoff?
yeah.
Geoff? I see where this is going. This is fascinating. I see the argument. I see what the experiment is going to be. I find it really persuasive. But there's another argument somebody can make, and I'm not sure you're going to get to this, which is that they could agree with you and with me that in that case you raised, it's really unfortunate nobody could kill the guy, and he should have been killed. He should have had his wishes granted. But the counter argument would go, well, but if you give physicians the power to actively kill, it might do good in some cases, but it's too much power and would lead to all sorts of abuses. And so put that way, it may be right or may be wrong, but it's not as plainly irrational as you would otherwise think it to be.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. That is a great point. And in some ways, I've got no evidence today that's going to really strongly defend against that point. So you've kind of skewered my argument at the first hurdle. But I guess what I would say is, so I think that's something that ought to be measured in this context. In some ways, you could say the same thing about rules for passive euthanasia. I mean, we do have various kinds of rules that are legally implemented that allow passive euthanasia. And there are, some of them are quite difficult. So it's not that easy for a doctor to enact passive euthanasia. So I guess the question that brings to my mind is, well, why are we not so worried about this excessive power or slippery slope type argument in the case of passive euthanasia, but active euthanasia somehow activates this more? I'm not exactly sure.
I think sorry.
Oh, no, please, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, I think there are answers. A doctor with the power of active euthanasia in the wrong hands could kill everybody he wants, while passive euthanasia, as you point out, would only kill people under very certain limited circumstances. So it's sort of less of a power. I don't view this as a sort of, I think this is maybe things to work out with people's intuitions about the science. Sorry, Chelsea.
Oh no, totally my fault. I was curious, speaking of circumstances, the majority of the motivating work you've presented has manipulated the functioning of humans. And I was curious if the directionality worked in the other way. So if you increase the perceived humanness of animals, do you start to get a taxonomy of euthanasia? So I'm thinking that there are some species that have the type of von Economo neurons that we have in our prefrontal cortex. Would telling people, this type of thing that we see often in social species like humans change their intuitions about the acceptability of killing animals? Because there are levers you can push here of making things more or less human. And I'm curious if you think they would work similarly in humans as they might in animals. Yeah,
that's a really interesting question. So I don't have evidence today that's going to speak to that. But I guess one thing that we've thought about here is it the case that people that especially anthropomorphize or especially value animal lives, is it possible that they show a pattern of judgments about euthanasia that is more closely matched to what most of our samples say about human lives? That is, they're actually opposed to the active killing of animals because they grant them this higher moral standing. I mean, you could do that, I guess, correlationally or with some sort of manipulation of anthropomorphization. I think that's a really interesting idea. So yeah.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, so let's see. I was just talking about this manual for the humane killing of animals, and so so now it comes to sort of the theory and then the hypotheses. So basic idea in this project is it's this high moral status that we grant to humans that seems to actually prevent us from treating them in accordance with what we take to be their best interests, whereas we don't have that same divergence for animals because we grant them lower moral status, and that lower moral status actually enables us in certain cases to treat them in accordance with their best interests. So that sort of high level theory. In terms of more concrete hypotheses, what we had in mind here is that in relevant cases, and this is poorly defined, but what I mean by relevant is cases where there may be some attraction to active euthanasia where immediate death might seem like an appealing option. People are going to support active over passive euthanasia, and they judge it to be in the animal's best interests, and there's an alignment of moral judgments and best interest judgments, whereas people won't support active euthanasia to the same extent for humans. Sometimes they might even actively oppose it, even though they also judge it as being in the human's best interests. So the question here is, can we find evidence for this sort of pattern of judgments. And I'm going to get through, I hope, 4 studies. They're all pre-registered. I'll just mention some consistent features of them. So we didn't study locked-in syndrome. I think it's a great motivating case, and it'd be interesting to do studies on it. But in these studies, we contrasted a human infant with a young animal. In all cases, they were suffering from a terminal disease and in intractable pain. The reason we chose an infant is we just thought it's more comparable to an animal because they don't yet have necessarily a concept of themselves. They don't yet necessarily have a concept of death. They don't have plans for the future. So it's sort of trying to equate a little bit more closely in terms of the entities in question. We asked people to make judgments about the morality of active or passive euthanasia. And in all studies, we have some measure of welfare consequences for the patient. So we started off by measuring judgments of pain that would be caused by the procedures. And then we moved later on to judgments about what people think is best for the patient. And these are all MTurk studies. Fortunately, they were run some time before some of the latest doubts have emerged about MTurk research, but future, I think we're going to go to prolific for this. Okay, so here's study 1. This is the vignette. We started off with this hypothetical made-up syndrome. We moved away from that later. But as you can see, it's a puppy or an infant boy. They have this nervous system disorder. It leads to chronic extreme pain. And there's no way to remediate the pain because we don't know much about this disorder. In order to keep the entity alive, medication needs to be provided or multiple organ failure will result. And the expected lifespan with this sort of default regime is 3 months. And what people were told is there are 3 options. One is to just keep providing medication, which leads to a 3-month painful lifespan. You could discontinue the medication right now, which would lead to passive euthanasia, and that would lead to a 3-day lifespan, but it would be painful. Or you could actively euthanize the patient with a lethal but painless injection leading to their immediate death. And between subjects, so those options were outlined, and then between subjects, we manipulated what was done. So some subjects judged passive euthanasia, other subjects judged active euthanasia. And we had some moral judgments. So to what extent do you agree or disagree with the decision? How moral or immoral do you think it is? And we aggregated them as a composite index of morality. And then we also asked a pain judgment. So let's say the choice was the lethal injection. It's a relative judgment relative to the default course of action to keep the patient alive. How much do you think this choice would reduce the infant or puppy's overall pain?
Geoff, can I ask a quick question?
Sure, yeah.
So I think this is a really interesting study, and I like where you're going with it a lot, but I am curious about the choice to use like a made-up syndrome, and the way that you described it is researchers not knowing much about it, like the research is ongoing. So it seems like there's not going to be a cure for it, but I'm wondering if participants, just because the stakes are so high in actively euthanizing an infant, what if actually, they can figure out a cure and the decision was premature? That seems to apply more to the human case than the puppy case.
Yeah, thanks, Gracie. That is a nice point. Yeah, I mean, this is, and you sort of bring up an issue that lingers over some of this research as well, which is, well, how do you know that the subjects are totally with you in believing the materials in the stimulus? Well, what if there's some other way? What if there's a miracle cure that might come along? I totally agree with you that using a made-up disorder is not optimal, and we did move away from that in the later studies. I hadn't actually thought about it in that context, but yeah, that's another reason why one may not want to do that.
Although, just chime in, to be fair to your method, I think people who are making those decisions in real life, there is often not 100% certainty that a child is going to die. So my aunt was a neonatologist who ran the infant ICU, and she was constantly trying to convince parents that a 98% chance or 99% chance of death within a few days was enough to passively euthanize. Yeah. And they just held on to that 1% as if it meant everything to them.
Right. Yeah, it sort of raises this interesting question, which we've not measured in any of these studies, which is whether people have more, I guess, irrational optimism in the case of a human as opposed to an animal patient, and how that factors into these decisions that they're making. So yeah, we don't have data on that, but yeah, it's a good point.
I have a question too. It seems like the person that it's wrong for is the doctor. Like it's the doctor who is not supposed to do this. And so when we have like state sponsored executions, right, they'll do things where the person who's doing the execution is somehow like 1 degree removed, right? It's like you don't see their face, or they don't know which gun has the bullet in it, if it's a firing squad, right? And so it like removes the responsibility from the actor.
Yep.
And in all of these cases, that is missing, right? It's like, you know, the doctor did it on purpose.
Yep.
And so I'm curious about what you think about changing features of the doctor rather than the patient.
Yeah, so that is an important factor as well. In these early studies, we didn't get at this. In the last study today, we asked a general question, which was designed to pick up something like this, among other things, which is just sort of thinking more broadly about the social consequences from the decision, thinking that, yeah, maybe one reason people object is that this just places too much of a moral burden on the doctor. And that's part of the reason for the objection. As you'll see, that actually maps on reasonably well with moral judgments, although when I get to it, I'm not totally convinced that that's like the dominant explanation, but it's certainly a relevant factor here as well. There are a lot of complex strains that go into these decisions. We're at a starting point trying to kind of boil this down into a somewhat simplified format, but that's not to say that, you know, the reality of these decisions is not like very complicated. Okay, so I'll just show you the graphs here. So these are moral judgments. Composite moral support for active euthanasia. People overwhelmingly favor it for the puppy, and they oppose passive euthanasia. For the infant, we didn't see outright opposition to active euthanasia here, but you can see there's a very different pattern of judgments. And the overall interaction here is highly significant. So morally speaking, not terribly surprisingly, we see a very different pattern of moral judgments for the two entities here. Then you can go to pain judgments. So how painful did they think the procedure would be? And people thought that active euthanasia would be greatly less painful than passive euthanasia for the puppy. And they thought similarly for the infant, though not quite to the same extent. I think the dominant message of these data is the large main effect of passive versus active. There is also a significant interaction, although I don't think that is as important here. But I guess what I would highlight is this does provide some initial evidence that for the animal, there's a kind of concordance of judgments here. The moral judgments seem to go along with the pain judgments, whereas for the infant, we don't see that same degree of concordance. And so you can look at that a little bit more formally with mediation analyses. So what we're looking at here are just, is the difference in moral judgments of active versus passive euthanasia mediated by assessments of the painfulness of the procedure and therefore some consideration of victim welfare? And so what we find is that that is true for puppies. So their moral judgments of the acceptability is mediated by judgments that active euthanasia is going to be less painful. That's why it's better. But we don't see that same mediation pattern for the infant. So sort of some evidence of dissociation of those two judgments here. Yeah, so that's sort of the message so far. Moral judgments seem to be more closely associated with pain or welfare judgments for animals as compared with humans. And that's basically going to be the theme of the next few studies, but we'll hopefully improve on them in a few different ways. So,
Geoff, are you going to use adults at all? Because if you are, then I won't ask my question.
No, I'm not in these studies, yeah.
So one of the things I was going to ask is, it's interesting to use infants, and I totally agree that that's like the place to go. But infants, you know, you start off with the deontological arguments of, you know, humans as having capacity for suffering and largely because they're rational creatures. It's hard to know what an infant wants, if it wants anything at all. And I think we're often inferring, I mean, we do this explicitly legally when we say, well, you say you want to die, but I don't believe you, because a truly rational person would not want to die. Maybe that's an assumption. But we don't have the same for infants where we're trying to infer what they would really want under like their coolest condition, you know?
Right, right. No, I totally agree. And so do you think that that is going to lead to sort of if it's somehow a fundamentally different pattern of judgments for the infant and the adult?
I don't know, but like picking the infant is exactly the right control, I think, for animals, because you're just manipulating the humanness. But it just seems like there are when I think about people, for instance, we actively stop people from killing themselves all the time, right? So we stop people on the bridge and say, no, you have something to live for, because we think that they would actually, once they calm down from whatever, you know, this, I'm not saying this is actually what people think, but we intervene because we think that they have true underlying desires that would be to live if only they weren't clouded by.
Right. Yeah, in some ways, this sort of reminds, it's sort of a similar species of possible consideration as, well, look, if we just wait long enough, there'll be a miracle cure that will make everything better for this person. If we just wait long enough, this person will snap out of it and they no longer would want to die. And yeah, it is possible that people think like that in these cases. And it's definitely worth looking at. So I think that'd be an interesting next step to take with this. Just for sort of from a normative point of view, you know, if you take a case like Tony Dickinson, the poor guy's had this condition for 7 years. He's consistently expressed this desire. At a certain point, you know, you kind of have to be like, well, you know.
Absolutely. I think actually, I wonder what you think, but I think we're actively resisting temptation to actively euthanize. Like in those cases, I think we're just like, shit, I have to have this rule, kind of like what Paul was saying. But like the temptation is just to you're telling the story, and I'm wishing one of his friends would have the guts to like just do it, and you know, and yeah. But
yeah, that's interesting. That almost frames it as a kind of moral self-control issue, where it's about trying to restrain some impulse.
Yeah, maybe it is. Anyway, thanks.
Geoff, to take something in a different direction, one of the questions in chat, which was interesting, was about how universal the prohibition against active euthanasia is, whether you'd find it in non-weird cultures.
Right.
Off that, I like the findings of the study, and maybe you do something like this later, but I wonder whether one reason why we morally disapprove of a doctor does active euthanasia is that that doctor is breaking the law.
Yeah.
And what I wonder is whether the results would shift. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. If you said, let me ask you about a culture which has no laws either way, they're both fully permitted.
Right.
Do you think then it would be more rational for the human case?
Yeah, so this question of legality is an important one. And in these early studies, we neglected it. In the last two studies, we do include an explicit stipulation that they should assume that it is legal and there's going to be no penalty to the doctor. Now, that can go so far. I mean, I don't know. I often have some question mark about how much this sort of explicit stipulation is actually going to work. Does it really get people into that mindset? That's what we've done so far. If there's a more thorough way to kind of unstitch those legal considerations, I'd love to use it.
I might be wrong in my facts, but based on a novel, I heard that in Amsterdam, doctors can do active euthanasia. So you say this all happens in Amsterdam.
Yeah, right. No, that's a good frame. We didn't do that. We didn't say, oh, look, this is somewhere else. This is not the United States. That would be more effective. Yeah. But anyway, what we see with the stipulation, it doesn't seem to change anything much. In fact, it actually becomes a little bit more clear, I think, probably for other reasons. So, okay, so I'll get to study 2 here. What we did, very similar design. Instead of using sort of euphemistic language here, we actually described this using the word killing. We thought perhaps one reason we're not seeing outright opposition to active euthanasia is for something like this reason. We also made the description of the pain a little bit more realistic. Maybe not that realistic that someone's in constant excruciating pain. So we described it as more moderate and still constant with spikes of very intense pain. And we also asked an auxiliary question here. Now, there are complications with this question, but what we were trying to get at here is a kind of more all-encompassing question about what people think is in the target's best interest. So instead of just asking about pain, which is one component of what might be in the best interest, it was sort of this more general question. So here's the vignette, very similar with the changes that I just mentioned. And we also, for somewhat arbitrary reasons, changed the lifespan to 1 month, and instead of life-preserving medication, it's some sort of life support mechanism, but I think those are just incidental features. And so it's a puppy or an infant again. And the additional question here was, carrying out the decision, whichever one it was, which you were randomly assigned to, do you think that would be in the infant's best interests? And people agreed or disagreed with that. So here's the data, similar number of subjects here. People were overwhelmingly in support of active euthanasia for the puppy, but things actually did not change much for the infant. There was basically indifference and a fairly clear interaction pattern. But again, we see a different pattern for pain judgments, where active euthanasia much less painful for both the puppy and the infant. And we see a very strong main effect, and in this case, no significant interaction. So again, we're seeing concordance of the pain judgments and the moral judgments for the puppy, but not for the human infant. Now, we expected that we'd see something like this for the best interests judgment, but actually things got a bit less clear here, which is sort of interesting. So best interest judgments, people thought, yep, active euthanasia is clearly in the puppy's best interest. And we thought that they would say the same thing for the infant, but in fact, they didn't. Their judgments for what was in the target's best interests actually more closely mapped onto the moral judgments. This is not really what we're predicting, and it was slightly puzzling. This is a significant interaction. But we also, perhaps in some defense of our theory, raised some potential, there were some concerns in our mind about what these best interest judgments were really telling us. On the one hand, this best interest language may be a little bit abstract for the average subject. And on the other hand, it came right on the back of the moral judgments. So there's some concern here about belief overkill or consistency pressure, where people are just transposing what they said for the moral judgment to the best interest case, and when maybe not getting the most accurate signal. So that was one thing we wanted to try to address in the next 2 studies. So I'll just give you a kind of overview of what these will do. One of the big goals is to try to assess a bit more clearly this relationship between moral judgments and best interest judgments. And to do that, we used some slightly less abstract measures of best interest. I'll show you them exactly in a second. Also, and I think this is maybe the key feature, we separated these judgments between subjects. So some people made judgments about the morality of the procedure. Other people just made judgments about what would be in the target's best interests, and this is designed to reduce consistency pressure. And the other thing we did, and there's certainly room for debate as to whether this is, as to the merits of doing this, but when we asked about the best interest judgments, we only asked them with reference to the consequence of each action, not the actions themselves. The reason we did this is we kind of wanted to screen off the scruples or objections people have to the specific actions and just get them to assess, okay, what would happen if you took this course of action? So you'll see how that plays out in a second. Obviously, you don't have to do it that way. You could do it in another way.
I forget real quickly, did you describe the method for passive euthanasia?
Yeah, in the scenarios, it's basically just the entity is being kept alive on life support, and passive euthanasia is just withdrawing that support, basically. We didn't tell them explicitly, and it'll be this painful. We led them to make inferences about that. And then the final thing we did, and this connects to something Paul was saying, is we instructed them that all options were legal and carried no penalty, but you could take that further, and I like the idea of how to do that. Okay, so the design is a bit more complicated, but I think it'll make sense. I hope it'll make sense. So subjects are making judgments of a 1-month-old infant or a puppy. That's between subjects. Also between subjects, they judge what's morally the best option and what's in the target's best interests. And then within subjects, this time they rate all 3 options. So previously we assigned them an option and they rated that. This time they rate all 3. So it's a 2x2x3 design. And this is the vignette here. There's actually not much to see here. This one's very similar to the one we used in study 2, but I'm just sort of showing you that for completeness. And okay, so in the moral condition, there are the same 3 options, and with that wording about legality and no penalty. And this is what it basically looked like to the subject. So oh, hang on, I'm not quite there yet. The questions were how moral or immoral and how much do you support or oppose each option. So it's a slightly different question here. And they gave those judgments for all three. So this is a screenshot from the survey. How moral or immoral do you think each option is? That's one of the moral judgments, and they just rated all three. And then how much do you support or oppose each option? They rate all three. And then the best interest judgments, we were trying to sort of concretize these for the subject. So this time, these judgments were how good or bad for the infant do you think each of the following possibilities is? And you'll notice we're not describing the method here. We are simply saying it continues to live for a month, or it continues to live for 2 days, or it dies immediately and painlessly. So we're sort of screening off the action component. And then the other one that we came up with here is just how advantageous or disadvantageous. Not surprisingly, that correlates very well with the other one. So those are the best interest judgments, and then subjects make those judgments or the moral judgments. And so what we're predicting is for the moral measures, active euthanasia will be preferred to passive for puppies, but not humans. And for the best interest measures, immediate death is going to be judged preferable for both puppies and humans. And if that works out, we should see a three-way interaction. So let's see how that works. Okay, so we again had 300 or so subjects. Moral support is overwhelmingly clear for the puppies for active euthanasia. And this time for the infants, we actually start to see a directional reversal that's non-significant, but it's the same general pattern that we've seen previously. That interaction is highly significant. Now, for the best interest judgments, where these are being made in isolation, separate from the moral judgments, and the wording is slightly different, people judge the consequences of active euthanasia, that is immediate and painless death, to be overwhelmingly in the best interest of the puppy and also overwhelmingly in the best interest of the infant. And the main story there, I think, is the main effect, although there is also a significant interaction just reflecting the degree of difference in those judgments for humans and infants. And we didn't quite reach significance on the three-way interaction here. So it's not quite where we might have wanted this to be. So that then gets me to the last study here. And this one has a very similar design, but one major difference is now we thought, well, we've been using puppies. Maybe that's not the best choice. First of all, they're a domesticated animal. People may have certain kinds of specific feelings about puppies that could be relevant to their judgment. So we basically said here, let's use a chimpanzee. It's genetically our closest relative. It's arguably a bit more comparable in that sense. So those judgments were made between subjects, and the rest of the design is the same. Morality or best interest judgments are being made between subjects, and then each option is being rated within subjects. So it's again 2 by 2 by 3. And the other thing that I actually think is turned out to be more relevant than we expected is this is the vignette, and you'll notice we described it as a homeless infant and a wild chimpanzee. This was just sort of a whimsical decision, but we just thought, well, look, this makes it a little bit more comparable. We're kind of equating a little bit more in terms of social ties, perhaps. In any case, that's what we did here. And then the rest of the vignette proceeds as the other ones have. And yeah, this is stuff that you've seen for the other studies. Same 3 options, same wording about legality, and the same predictions. Preference for active euthanasia for chimps, but not humans. But generally speaking, for the best interest measures, we'll see immediate death as being judged preferable. So that, if all works to plan, should be a 3-way interaction. And we significantly increased the sample size here. So we have just under 800 after exclusions. And what we see here is, again, this very familiar pattern. For the chimp, active euthanasia is highly preferred. This time, for the first time, we see a significant reversal where people are opposing active euthanasia for the infant, and they're significantly more supportive of passive euthanasia. Not exactly sure why this reversal is happening. It could just be chance, but the fact that the infant is homeless may be one factor. If anything, I sort of thought, well, that might actually dampen down opposition to active euthanasia, but perhaps there's a kind of sympathy effect. The infant's not just is the infant homeless, but you're about to kill it. Perhaps that's one reason. And then for the best interest judgments, we see a very similar pattern. So overall, immediate death is judged to be in the best interest of both the chimp and the infant. And this time we do see a highly significant 3-way interaction pattern, again showing concordance between best interest judgments and moral support for the animals, but not for the humans. Okay, so
Geoff,
yeah,
can I ask something related to the social ties point?
sure.
So I'm actually reminded, I think that's a really strong point to make. And I'm reminded actually of your work with Justin Landy about valuing different human lives over the course of the lifespan.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what you think you might get for children in middle childhood and say like a dog or a chimp that's not an infant.
Right.
Whether you might get something like this where we're actually, or rather maybe even closer to what you report in the earlier studies where we're very much opposed to euthanasia in those cases because maybe, or active euthanasia in those cases because of the relationship that those children have to their family members.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, I think, the difference between very young infants and older children, it's reliable, it's not huge, but if anything, I think that would make this pattern more pronounced in that people would probably be more opposed to active euthanasia for an older child that has social connections and also has a more developed personal identity and so on. So if anything, I think it would probably amplify that. You do that, of course, at the cost of a little bit of experimental control, but still could be interesting to look at.
Geoff, I have two questions or comments. The first is about the fact that you're getting this reversal on moral support for the infant here. And you also seem to get in study 3, although it wasn't significant with a smaller sample. It seems like the main difference between studies 1 and 2 and 3 versus 3 and 4 is like the within versus between nature of the design.
Yeah, you're right.
So it's like, I feel like maybe if people have to actively compare active versus passive, they're like, oh, whoa. If you had passive as an option, and I really have to think about that, then active doesn't seem quite as good. That was sort of one take on that.
Yeah.
But then I also have a question about the best interest judgments. So when they're making the best interest judgments, they're not making them with respect to euthanasia, right? They're just making them with respect to the baby dies immediately.
Yep.
And I think that might come back to the optimism point that was raised before, because I feel like one reason it might not be in the best interest of the infant to kill the infant because the infant could recover.
Right.
But it might be in the best interest of the infant who dies immediately, because if the infant died immediately, the infant couldn't recover in that case. So maybe that's one way to make sense of why you're getting those kinds of differences.
Yeah, so on the first point about the comparative judgments, thanks for reminding me of that. That's clearly a factor that could be relevant here in amplifying that pattern. I also think that the comparative judgments are preferable because in the real world, it's not like you're just judging active euthanasia in isolation from any other consideration of options. In terms of the point about sort of screening off the action, I definitely hear what you're saying. And to me, this is a little bit of a conundrum as to how you get at this, because on the one hand, the procedure we used allows you to screen off the action components. And one worry that I have is that when you ask a person the question, is it in the best interest to kill this individual for a human, they can't help but migrate some of their moral scruples about that into the judgment about best interests. And that's why we did this, but I totally agree with you that it means that they're not exactly comparable, and that's an point we have to sort of acknowledge. I still am tempted to think that the pattern of the different patterns that you see for the chimp and the infant are quite noteworthy here, and this sort of alignment between best interest judgments and moral support for the infant, but not for the chimp, but not for the infant, is noteworthy. But there are I think there are pros and cons of either way you look at it here, but I guess the best approach is to do both.
Yeah, just to be clear, I think the way you did it is I can't think of a better way to do it. So it wasn't really a criticism. I also do think the optimism point is harmed a bit by the reversal that you're getting on moral support, because if you have a lot of optimism, then you should also be against passive euthanasia.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Because you think the baby is going to get better. Right. And so you shouldn't like you should be really negative on both kinds. So I don't necessarily think that's really what's going on here. And I totally respect the decision to divorce the best interest judgments from the context of euthanasia.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And it's one that we talked about, but my brain's operating a bit slowly and I didn't access it. But yeah, in order for this irrational optimism thing to work, you sort of have to say, well, there's almost this 2-day window in which you think, well, let's just wait at least for those 2 days. Something miraculous could happen in those 2 days, because yeah, the same point applies just as well to passive euthanasia. Why do that if you think there's some chance of recovery?
Can I ask you a question about, I'm curious about the underlying distribution of responses and whether they're normal. And the reason that I'm curious about that is because one possibility is that the chimp decision or the puppy decision is not in the moral domain. It's like a practical question. It's kind of like an animal control question. And the human domain is moral. And now I can't think about pros and cons at all. That's taboo, right? And so then my responses would be bimodal, basically, rather than normally distributed, because it's like taboo to think about it in that more
bimodal in the human case. Yeah.
And then you might get these kind of like closer to zero judgments, right, if you've got 3 and -3.
Yeah, no, so that's an interesting point. I haven't looked closely at distributions, particularly in the human case. I mean, it is possible that you get some people that are just totally okay with active euthanasia, they're totally on board with it, and then other people who are not, and you sort of get this score somewhere in the middle. Yeah, it's a good note to look at that. Whether people think that the moral decision is not in the moral domain, that's also interesting. We haven't asked that. I guess you could ask a question about that, although I guess my prior belief on that would be people probably think of this as a moral decision, because it's pretty, there's a lot of pain there, and I tend to think people will think of that as moral, but I don't know for sure. We haven't shown that.
I tend to, yeah, I think I'm presenting it as extreme for rhetorical reasons. I agree that probably people do think it's in the moral domain, but I wonder, it seems like there's some difference. If one is, you're getting this kind of like linear, like dose sensitivity for one and not the other, that suggests that like the human one has more like taboo in it or something.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, just to maybe piggyback off of that, I think that's a really nice point, but I actually think that the data are even more compelling given, like in the puppy case, that I think we often do think, at least in American society, that dogs have high moral standing, they have high moral value. And
Right.
so I think if there was to be a contender for something mirroring human moral standing, it would be a domesticated animal. So I think that makes your point even stronger, that you're finding these kinds of effects in favor of active euthanasia for something that I think is actually a close parallel to human moral value.
Yeah, and I think you're right about that, because people will call themselves like dog moms.
Right.
I had a question, if you've thought about adjusting for the perceived normativity. So I'm thinking about, we have a lot of experience with the idea of active euthanasia for dogs, or in the Australian wildlife example, like it's certainly on the table as a normative option in this circumstance. And I was curious if you thought about isolating that variable by saying, like, introducing, I don't know, like an alien species that has the functioning of a chimpanzee, but something we don't necessarily have experience with euthanizing, and sort of adjusting for the normativity of the decision in that way.
Yeah, that is an interesting point. So it reminds me of some of the approaches that you sometimes see in experimental philosophy. There's a paper on moral standing by Mashery and Sitzmer, I think, which uses something like that. Yeah, that could be a good way to sort of get away from that. So yeah, thanks. I like that. Okay. Well, I don't have more data to present to you, but I do just have a couple of kind of summary comments, and so let me just say those things. So anyway, I think the arguments, I've said this a few times, but basically we know that humans are typically held to have greater moral status than animals from other research that results in more stringent prohibitions against killing them. But I think what's interesting about this is that it also means that moral judgments about how to treat humans can depart from what we ourselves think is in their best interests, whereas in matched animal cases, you see alignment between the moral judgments and the best interest judgments. And so in terms of, at the risk of overstating things, what's the contribution here? Well, clearly it's not the distinction between active and passive killing. We already know that. But I do think what's new is this point about alignment. and the fact that this occurs notwithstanding the higher moral status that we grant humans. So one thing I did want to just get to in closing is, well, what explains this? And this is apart from the other weaknesses of this project, I think this is probably the major weakness. We don't really know what explains this, and I'm not exactly sure the best way to move forward with this. So let me just run a couple of possibilities. Maybe there's some just sort of immediate emotional aversion to actively killing humans. Fari Cushman has this really interesting paper where he shows that people have this resistance to simulating murder with a toy gun. And that seems to be sort of consistent with this idea of just a brute level emotional aversion. That might be what's going on here, although I still find myself a little bit stuck with that as an explanation, because it makes me wonder, well, why is there that emotional aversion? Isn't there some more basic evaluative process that gives rise to it? But something like that could be part of the story. There's another option, which is maybe people are considering secondary negative consequences from killing that are not captured by our primary measures. And this includes things like the moral burden on the doctor or the moral burden on family members. Ed Roisman has this great research looking at incest dilemmas that have been used by Haidt, and he basically shows that in those dilemmas, people actually have these quite subtle consequentialist objections to protected sibling incest, like the relational harm that will do, which are not really that well picked up by the original studies. Maybe something like that is going on here. We made a sort of half-hearted stab at that in our last study, where we just asked people this global question, which was supposed to be a kind of catch-all for these kinds of secondary negative consequences. And it actually turns out that that mirrored the moral judgments really well. So I won't go through all the details here, but it's the same basic pattern, the same two-way interactions and the same three-way interaction for these judgments for other people. However, this one has the same problem as I mentioned earlier for the best interest judgments. It came right on the back of the moral judgments. To what extent is consistency pressure playing a role here? And I personally find it a little bit hard to believe that it's this judgment which is the primary driver of the main moral judgment. It might be a factor, but I'm a little skeptical that it's the main thing. And then the third thing, and I have to say I'm sort of partial to something like this, is that people just hold these moral rules that prohibit active killing. They've learned them culturally or religiously, and they just have this kind of rigidity about these rules. I think that's linked to the first explanation, that having this rule might lead to a kind of emotional aversion. But I guess where I'm stuck on this is, how do you show this? What sort of evidence would be compelling evidence that this is the right explanatory story as opposed to any of these other ones? So yeah, we're certainly not done with the project. And with that sort of slightly deflating ending, I guess I will stop there and ask for any more questions before we close.
I think that's a wonderful talk, and there's a parallel case which I've often struggled with, which seems to share similarities of your work, which is we're very reluctant to torture people for punishment, to whip them or to mutilate them or so on. And people say it's too cruel. But if somebody said, would you rather spend 5 years in a maximum security prison or have your finger chopped off, I choose to lose the finger. And I bet most people would say, both. It's worse to spend the years in prison, but also you can't chop off your finger because it's too cruel. And there's a weird contradiction there, I think, which is similar to the contradiction you find in your work.
Yeah, that's great. That's a really nice parallel case.
If anybody wants to do that research with me, by the way, I always want to do that.
Geoff, this not so much a question, I think, but just I want to know your thoughts about whether there is something special about killing. I mean, sort of what Paul's saying, but maybe a little different. I mean, so there are people who really, 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 really want to be amputated, but they have no medical condition that would require it.
Mm.
Are people just as likely to have this like active versus passive intuition about those cases? Like, there's a way of getting it. What are we desire satisfactionists about this stuff? Like, what are we doing in our judgments?
Yeah, no, that's another great parallel case. I don't know how to answer that question. I don't know exactly what people are doing. The other thing that this discussion makes me think is slightly unrelated, but we have this other stream of research on looking at people's desired punitive reactions to abusers of children who are sexual abusers versus violent abusers of children. And one thing we find is, even if you hold constant the exact act, but you say, and it's non-sexual, it's totally non-sexual, if you manipulate whether it was motivated for a sexual reason or as opposed to kind of some violent or power-based reason, people have this, they have a much more punitive reaction to the sex-motivated action. And so there's sort of another case where you sort of see this real amplification of people's moral responses in a way that doesn't exactly align with their judgments of harm, because it's exactly the same act in this case. And I don't know, I think this example and
that's super interesting.
Yeah, the torture
so
example,
cool.
they sort of all funnel into the same thing, but what's going on? I'm not exactly sure.
That's fascinating, Geoff. Really interesting talk. Really great discussion. So thanks so much for presenting to us, and thanks to all of the panelists for taking time to be here for part of this. And finally, thanks for our audience for being here. Lots of great questions came in. We gave voice to a couple, but all of them will get to Geoff, and I'm sure he'll appreciate them as well. So thanks everybody for coming here today. Enjoy your weekend.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it.